Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Fair Game. I'm Jameis, and this is episode 2 of our Snake's Revenge run. In this one, we're going to be completing the ship, and also with that, chapter 1. I took the liberty of farming the two enemies in the previous room over and over again for rations so that we're properly supplied for the next section. Without further ado, it's time to board the transport ship and get this whole thing underway. With the lone exception of the train later on, this is the single most linear area in the entire game, which is ironic because it's actually a much more difficult area than the first base. This, despite no side-scrolling areas entirely. The difficulty increase is entirely legitimate and comes from guard patrols that are both bigger in number and smarter placed, as well as much more aggressive about checking their flanks. So while our first order of business is recollecting supplies right here, mostly because after the last boss fight we're a little dry on both explosives and grenades, and those are two things we're going to need. But while we're doing that, let's talk about story a bit more. And additionally, the title of the game itself, Snake's Revenge. At a glance, the title makes absolutely no sense. What is Snake supposed to be avenging? He loses two teammates over the course of the mission, but one's about halfway through the game and the other is almost at the end of the game. According to the same friend who gave me most of the information I now have about the Famicom version of Snake's Revenge, the revenge is because the Outer Heaven remnants wound up killing the Resistance members that Snake worked alongside in Metal Gear 1, specifically Diane and Schneider. In a weird frickin' coincidence, this is actually something borne out by the Ultra Games version of the box and manual, suggesting that it was the deaths of Schneider and Diane that caused Snake to push up this thing in priority. All of which has led me to a very entertaining and very interesting realization. Snake's Revenge and Metal Gear 2, broadly, tell the same story. They tell it entirely differently and with completely different story beats, but the two have almost identical plot points. In Snake's Revenge, Snake gets involved because of the deaths of Schneider and Diane. In Metal Gear 2, as the very first cyborg ninja you fight in the entire series, Schneider fights Snake and reveals what happened to the Resistance group after the fall of Outer Heaven, namely that the government killed them all. The final boss of Snake's Revenge and the final boss of Metal Gear 2 are the same character. Both games are about an Outer Heaven remnant group that has since recouped itself and managed to create a stronger Metal Gear in the process. These story beats are generic enough that it could very well be coincidence, but considering the production timeline of both games, I really don't believe that. Snake's Revenge came out only a few months before Metal Gear 2. However, since we are talking about what made Snake's Revenge a little bit harder to understand, here's a great example of English. What the officer is supposed to be saying here is that because Metal Gear is so difficult to destroy, Snake would be better off sinking the entire ship by blowing the ammo dump. We will be doing this, of course, but one thing at a time. To get back to what I was saying, though, we know that the dev team that was working on Snake's Revenge was in constant contact with Kojima during the production of Metal Gear 2. As a result, I don't really think it's that much of a stretch to consider that Snake's Revenge may have had more influence on Metal Gear 2 than most people give it credit for. I remember back when I was in high school, back in the 90s, fans of Snake's Revenge and fans of Metal Gear 2 were basically bros. Metal Gear during this time period was still very much niche, and for the most part, Metal Gear fans broadly loved both games, albeit for their own reasons. Metal Gear 2 having its technological achievements as well as its legendary storytelling and music, whereas Snake's Revenge was able to accomplish its own level of technical mastery with what it was able to do on the NES, and was much more action-oriented. Well, it probably seems shocking to younger fans, MSX and NES Metal Gear fans coexisted peacefully in these days and genuinely liked both games. Anyway, this prisoner gives us some useful information for once, that there is something important in the bottom of the ship, and boy is he underselling that. The ship genuinely has one of the more interesting reveals in Snake's Revenge, and I gotta say, considering the limitation of the hardware and everything else, it's actually pretty well done. I'm not going to spoil it for first-timers, I'm going to let you see it when we get there. There are 3 new items that you can acquire on the ship. Card number 3, the flare gun, and the mine detector. With the exception of card number 3, all the others are optional. They're just extremely helpful and you kind of want them for what's coming up ahead. There's also a completely optional weapon you can pick up right here, but since it's right across from the boss room, it's pretty easy to get. Even if you miss it, however, you'll get it again later on. Interestingly, Snake's Revenge only has 4 main bosses, and then there's 3 at the end. This is compared to Metal Gear's 10 and Metal Gear 2's 11. Snake's Revenge's bosses mostly make up for it by mechanically being a lot more complicated. They often require a lot more dodging and positioning than other bosses in other Metal Gear games. They also encourage you to use different weapons and different tactics depending on how you play. For example, you saw the strat I used on the quarterback mercenaries, even if it was slightly lax because I'm not the best at dodging in this game. If you were to compare it, however, to the very first fair game I did on Snake's Revenge, you'll notice that my strategy back then was completely different. I just slugfested them with the pistol, effectively brute-forcing a fight that could have been finessed a lot easier. You're going to see a much more finesse-oriented strategy for the next boss, I promise. In the meantime, however, let's go pick up that optional weapon I was telling you about earlier. These are Claymore mines. Now a staple in the Metal Gear series, This weapon started here. They're exceptionally useful, if not a common weapon. However, they do have an interesting mechanical bug, and it's a rather funny one, so I'll share it with you. Claymores in Snake's Revenge are remote detonated, just like the real thing, actually. They're supposed to work in such a way where the direction you place them is the direction they fire in, so if you're facing upwards, they fire upwards. However, something mechanically went wrong with the thing, and instead of exploding in the direction that the claymore was placed, they now explode in the direction you're currently facing. If anything, this, with a little bit of micromanagement, makes them even stronger since it allows you to do these crazy Hail Mary around the corner shots. Suffice to say, claymores in Snake's Revenge are awesome, but enough of that, because it's boss fight time. Boss 2 of Snake's Revenge is the Elite Grenadier unit. These guys do a ridiculous amount of damage, and they start off behind cover. You have a couple of different strategies you can use depending on how you want to fight them, but you definitely need to stay moving. 2 grenades will kill you. The easiest way to take them out, at least for the initial 2, is to use grenades yourself. It takes about 6 grenades to kill 1 grenadier. Needless to say, you won't have enough grenades to kill all 3 this way. Because of this, once you off the first 2, you gotta work something out for dealing with the 3rd one. You also have to avoid falling in the holes because they're booby-trapped and will kill you instantly. You can use your pistol or submachine gun after running past the barricades, or you can use your new claymore mines. But for me, I have a slightly better approach. Plastic explosives. The blast, if you place it directly on the sandbag barrier, is just big enough to hit them, and they do take full damage from it. Overall, I'd say they're actually the easiest boss in the entire game, which is kind of ironic considering the boss that came before them. Still quite a challenge, however, especially if you're not ready for them. Interestingly, they're actually supposed to look a little bit more like the standard Grenadier guys with the helmets, but due to a color palette issue, that doesn't happen, and as a side effect, they wind up looking a lot like King Hippo from Punch-Out, which I find mildly amusing. In an alternate timeline, when King Hippo never made it to the WVBA, he turned to a life of terrorism. Anyway, with these guys gone, we have access to Card 3. Card 3 is necessary to access the mine detector, as well as the cargo hold in the bottom of the ship. I'd actually like to take a moment to cover a couple of things that I didn't get to cover during the previous episode. The item drop system in Snake's Revenge is actually from the original MSX Metal Gear. It was just removed from the NES version due to space constraints. Relatedly, if you kill a soldier with a knife as opposed to your fist, they do sometimes still drop items, but the drop rate is significantly lower. The silencer in Snake's Revenge works for both the pistol and submachine gun, though interestingly, the latter one is a coding bug. Submachine gun you can get in Snake's Revenge is a silenced MP5, the MP5 SD. However, whether by accident or design, it will only be silenced if you have the pistol silencer. Unlike a lot of the other ones, I am actually willing to believe that that one's more just an intentional one rather than a bug, since frankly it's the way the other Metal Gear games handle it. In this room, we recover a brand new weapon, the flare gun. Though this is less of a weapon and more of a useful tool, since Snake can't just shoot flares at enemies blood style. Though that would be awesome! Instead, the flare gun is now your way of dealing with dark rooms, basically replacing the flashlight from the original Metal Gear. I will say that it's a cooler way to do it, but the fact that the ammo is really hard to come by is kind of annoying. That might be why dark rooms are comparatively uncommon in Snake's Revenge. And here we get the mine detector, which is vitally important for the munitions compound ahead. The area is more littered with mines than an African warlord's border, and they're significantly more damaging than they were in the previous game. Once we fully restock on equipment, which we desperately need to do, we will head to the basement for the big reveal of this section. It's a big reveal that I feel personally may have inspired a similar plot element in Metal Gear Solid 2. Did you notice that Snake's Revenge is actually the first game in the series to have portraits in the transceiver menu when you're calling somebody? Metal Gear 2 would have this, and the emulated re-releases of the MSX version of Metal Gear have a portrait of Snake added to the transceiver menu. But Snake's Revenge did it first. Actually, that reminds me of something I read once, and I don't know if it's true, but if it is, it would be freaking hilarious. Namely, that because Metal Gear 2 has so many characters that look like actual actors, this resulted in a rather shady legal area, and this was one of the reasons the game didn't get released in the West until much later. I don't know if I fully buy that one, because frankly, the MSX didn't have any penetration in the West, and I think that has a lot more to do with it. But it is absolutely unquestionable that a lot of characters in Metal Gear 2 look like actual people. Well beyond coincidence territory and well into, okay, this is very obviously a reference. Gray Fox looks like Tom Berenger. Gustavo looks like Ann Brunner. Snake looks like Mel Gibson. Roy Campbell looks like Richard Crenna. Kazler unmistakably looks like Dolph Lundgren, and Big Boss looks like Sean Connery. When we finally did get a Western port in 2007, all the portraits had been changed to much more obviously reflect the art style that had been prevalent in Metal Gear at the time. So there may actually be a nugget of truth to that. Who knows? Interestingly, the helicopter pilot in Snake's Revenge has the same name as the helicopter pilot in Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, Charlie, which A, makes me think they're the same character, and B, kind of makes me imagine them being voiced by Critical now. Though I dare say that may be a bit too much levity even for an old NES game. An interesting quirk about Snake's Revenge compared to the original Metal Gear is that the AI for the guards is actually significantly better. In the original Metal Gear, they're basically scripted to run towards the player firing the second they actually are alert to them. The ones in Snake's Revenge aren't as aggressive, and they're actually scripted to take cover, doing this mostly by weaving to the sides while they approach the player, opening fire. They're a lot more shooty than the previous guards. Their bullets also do significantly more damage. The main downside to it is that in more complicated areas, their pathfinding can screw up a little and they sort of get lost. They'll still keep shooting though. Interestingly, the only enemies you can actually melee in the game are the guards, the door blocker boxes, and the grenadier enemies that show up in Building 6. You need weapons to take out basically every other enemy in the game. The strongest normal enemy you encounter in the game is the Gunwalker, which you'll encounter right before the last boss's room. Consider it a 1990s version of a gecko from MGS4 and you have a general idea of what it is. They only have 32 hit points, but I've never actually killed one. Additionally, while I realize it's not much of an accomplishment, Snake's Revenge actually happens to have one of the best Tiger Electronics games. I realize the Tiger LCD games are, at their best, mildly entertaining, and at their worst, an experience I can liken to getting a tetanus shot while you're being lit on fire, but this one actually has digitally sampled speech as well as significantly more memory, allowing it to basically put in a better game. It's still a Tiger game at the end of the day, so you're basically looking at the video game equivalent of a digital calculator, but it is leagues better than a lot of the other crap that Tiger was crapping out at about this time. Someday I gotta do a thing on Tiger, and specifically why the Gamecom failed, because God, that is an interesting story. But honestly, we're going off focus and we should really concentrate on the task at hand. Once we've fully restocked on explosives, grenades, and of course flare bombs, then we can go into the basement. The last one especially because the rooms are completely dark down there unless you have the flare gun. Even more so because there are hidden enemies down in the cargo hold, and you can only see them if you use the flare gun. It also reveals where the obstacles are, obviously. It's important to remember that elevators in Snake's Revenge basically function as save rooms. Escaping to an elevator room also usually resets the alarms, so it's worth considering if you absolutely do not want to fight a hit squad right now. Humorously, it actually took a young Jameis quite a while to figure out how the elevators on the ship worked. Part of my ongoing campaign to go back to games which bullied me as a child and bully them in return, I suppose. With everything acquired, we can finally go into the basement and work our way to the cargo hold. Now, up until this point, it's been heavily suggested that what the enemy is transporting is Metal Gear, and that's not inaccurate, but the full truth is that they're transporting the new VRC-1, a mass production model Metal Gear, basically a scaled down and up armored version of the TX-55. Enough of them to outfit basically every single one of the PMCs that were formerly affiliated with Outer Heaven. A pretty terrifying prospect if handled a bit awkwardly due to the sheer limitations of the NES. Even worse, taking out all of these things one by one, assuming the same method that worked on the TX-55 works on them, is completely non-viable. Thankfully, we've worked out an alternate way to deal with the problem. So to get around this, we're going to do what that one officer suggested. We're going to blow up the ammo dump and send this boat to the bottom of the ocean, taking these Metal Gears with them. They'll be rendered basically unusable if we can get this thing to crush depth. So all we need to do is set a plastic explosive right on the ammo dump and then get ready to run like hell. Because the second we blow this thing, and it blows rather spectacularly, I will admit, you have about a minute to get off this boat before this thing sinks under the waves. And obviously takes you with it. It's one of only 2 times in the entire game you're able to use the radar mapper, which allows you to figure out where something is based on a transmitter. The evac point is one of the lifeboat launches, and you have some help getting to it. But first, you have to make your way back to the first floor, and you gotta do so fast. There is no time to dawdle. This is not a time where you want to be fumbling around in your inventory trying to figure out what keycard opens what door. Because frankly, every second is precious, and even I have difficulty getting out of there with more than 20 seconds remaining. The radar mapper will lead you right to the east side of the ship on the first floor. When you get there, Charlie will open up the evac point for you. The old-fashioned way, with Hellfire missiles. Also, I assure you that if you find the vibration effect annoying, you are not alone in that regard. But you can see why I was referencing Metal Gear Solid 2 earlier. A large-scale ship carrying a Metal Gear that ultimately winds up sinking. Now, I know Kojima himself will never cop to it, especially in this modern age where Snake's Revenge isn't really as well liked, but I also know from personal experience that Kojima is loath to throw anything away, and given that personal experience, I kinda wonder if this was a reference. As is so often the case, we'll never really know for sure, because why the hell would we? And at this point, all we can really do is theorycraft over it. Anyway, with this, we have successfully escaped the ship, and in so doing, we have successfully beaten the first chapter of Snake's Revenge. Chapter 2 involves us tracking down where these shipments were originally headed, specifically to the largest of the Outer Heaven remnant groups. Unfortunately for us, John is not only missing in action, but we've also lost contact with Nick. Beating Chapter 1 has, however, made us rank 3, increasing our life total and giving us more reserve items. We've got a lot to explore and a lot of ground to cover in the upcoming areas. I've been Jameis, and thank you for watching Episode 2 of our run, and stay tuned for next time.